Chapter 11, Cape of Good Hope, Thursday, August the 1st, 1895. Will stood at the side of the ship, leaning over the rail, looking at the wake the ship created. He thought back to that day when he was in Captain Hawkins' cabin. When the captain pointed at Europe, Africa, and India on the map, Will knew he wasn't ready to go home. He was glad he hadn't told the rest of the crew he was leaving. When he went to Boatswain Damon, Seaman Matthew, and Joseph with his decision to stay, they just laughed. They understood, because after their first voyage they felt the same way. You feel that you have seen the world, and it seems everything after that will just be a repeat adventure. But the world is so big with so much to see and so many people to meet, you can never experience it all. They also knew that the love for the sea gets in your blood, and the search for new adventures is always exciting. This was a special trip for Will, especially when Captain Hawkins informed him that after trading in Europe, they were going to trade along the African coast. This was what Will was thinking about as he looked down at the water. Africa. He had heard a lot about it, and the thought of going there caused him to have feelings that he couldn't quite understand. He thought of his mother Kazar and her Cherokee Native North American heritage and the influence it had on his life. His knowledge of his African heritage, however, was limited to his father's slavery experience. Will was certain this would be a life-changing journey for him, and the opportunity to find out more about his roots was why he was so anxious to go on this trip. He knew his sister Parthena's husband Henry Walls's family came from the Guinea coast of Africa, but he wasn't quite sure about his family. The Perry family wasn't able to trace back specifically where they originated, although his father said they descended from a tribe of tall Africans somewhere along the west coast. Will finally returned back to his work as the Flying Clipper continued sailing swiftly across the Atlantic to their first stop in Liverpool, England. The hold of the ship was laden with tobacco, sugar, and lumber. These items from America were luxuries in Europe, so the demand was high. Liverpool was one of Britain's major ports for passengers traveling to America and for other commerce. It was only exceeded by the port of London. By the middle of the 18th century, Liverpool was the center of a trade triangle between the Americas, England, and Africa. This triangle of trade, including the slave trade, allowed Liverpool to become very prosperous, and the city rapidly expanded. The Port of London is located along the banks of the River Thames in London, England. This port was the busiest one in the world in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the wharves eventually extended along the river for 11 miles. The Thames River connected London with the global market for trading Britain's goods. Liverpool and the London port were the destination of the Flying Clipper. Captain Hawkins knew the exchange of goods at these two stops would greatly increase the profits of this voyage. When they docked in London, the first thing Will wanted to do was visit Buckingham Palace, the official residence of the British monarch. He wanted to see the Queen they always sang about in school and try to understand why many Canadians continue to think of themselves as British citizens. The same year Will graduated from school, Canada gained its independence from England, not by war, but in a peaceful way. It was on July 1, 1867, when the British North America Act joined the colonies of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario. These colonies became the first four provinces of the Confederation of Canada and were followed on July 15, 1870 by Manitoba, then British Columbia, July 20, 1871. On July 1, 1873, Prince Edward Island became a part of Canada. A Canadian holiday to celebrate the country's birthday was established on the 1st of July, 1879, and it was called Dominion Day. In the 1900s, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Newfoundland Labrador became provinces, which brought the total number of provinces to 10. Once they had unloaded their cargo, the boatswain went looking for Will. "Hey, matey, do you want to go with me so I can take you on a tour of London?" he asked Will. "I'll also show you where I grew up." "I sure do," Will answered. "Okay, just give me a few minutes while I report to the captain and tell him the hold is clean and ready to load the cargo. We will then head to Buckingham Palace, where we might even catch a glimpse of Queen Victoria, the boatswain said. Will was excited about the possibility of seeing royalty. He was also interested in seeing the Tower of London and the famous Big Ben clock tower. After seeing the captain, the boatswain met Will at the top of the gangplank. "I'm ready, matey. Let's go see the Queen," he said, smiling to Will. The two men made their way through the streets of London, heading to the palace. Will was amazed by the architecture of all the homes and buildings. They were so much older than those in Canada and the United States, and this fact made him realize how young the countries in North America were in comparison. When they reached the palace, they saw many other sailors and tourists who had come there to see the residence of the British monarchy. The boatswain told him that originally Buckingham Palace was known as Buckingham House. It became the official royal palace on the accession to the throne by Queen Victoria in 1837. Ownership of the property before that had changed hands many times. During the Saxon times, owners included Edward the Confessor and his queen consort Edith of Wessex. When the Norman William the Conqueror captured England, he gave the property to Geoffrey de Mandeville, who bequeathed it to the monks of Westminster Abbey. In 1536, the site of Buckingham Palace finally returned into royal hands for the first time since William the Conqueror had given it away almost 500 years earlier. "So what do you think, Will? Would you like to have a home like this someday?" the boatswain asked. Will smiled and said, "It's a little small for me, but I'm sure if a few more rooms were added, it would be big enough." They continued walking around London, visiting a lot of interesting historical places. Before they returned to the ship, Boatswain Damon took Will to meet some of his friends in his old neighborhood. Everyone was so happy to see him and wanted to hear all about his adventures on the Flying Clipper. The next morning, the crew spent the day loading the hold with the goods they would trade along the African coast in exchange for gold, ivory, shells, and other items. When they were ready to weigh anchor, Captain Hawkins came to the boatswain and told him to blow the whistle and summon all men on deck. Once everyone was present and accounted for, the captain began to address them. "Men, our next port will be Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, Africa. From there we will trade along the west coast and then prepare for sailing around the Cape of Good Hope. I will talk to you as a group again before we start that part of the journey." "Thank you, gentlemen," the captain concluded. Turning to Will and the boatswain, he ordered them to raise the anchor. The history of Monrovia is unique because it was settled by emancipated slaves from the United States. The city originally was called Christopolis, but in 1824 it was renamed after James Monroe, who was the President of the United States at that time. It became the only non-American capital city in the world named after a U.S. president. Will was excited about the prospect of visiting this city. When they landed in Monrovia, it was the first time Will had stood on the land of his father's ancestors. His father, Uncle Jim, and their friend John Freeman Walls were of pure African descent. All three, however, were born in the United States, so this was also the first time Will had seen people that were born and still lived in Africa. This was an opportunity for him to begin his research, to find out exactly what part of this continent his father's family came from. He began walking the streets of Monrovia, engaging the citizens in conversation and asking many questions. He felt that learning about the history of Liberia may help him find clues to where his family's roots began. He found out that Liberia is bordered by the countries Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Côte d'Ivoire. Liberia means land of the free and was founded as an independent nation with the support of the U.S. government for free-born and former enslaved blacks. The more Will learned about the country of Liberia, the more he became convinced his ancestors may not have come from there. When he returned to the Flying Clipper, he went directly to Boatswain Damon to share what he had learned that day. "Liberia is a unique country, Boatswain, but I don't know if my ancestors came from here," Will said, obviously disappointed. "I'm sure you will eventually solve the mystery of your family's ancestry," the boatswain assured him. "With very little information of exactly where we came from, it may be next to impossible," Will said. "Did you ever think of visiting the local griot?" the boatswain asked. "What's a griot?" Will wanted to know. A griot is a West African poet, musician, and keeper of the oral history. Griot is the English and French word, but in the African languages they are referred to as jelly, jolly, Guel, Gallo, and Igli. To the community in which they live, it doesn't really matter what name they're called because they are the keepers of local history and have knowledge of many things. They tell tales of births, deaths, marriages, battles, and other events that happen in their villages and the rest of Africa. So if you share your family history with the local griot, perhaps he can give you some important information about the people you could have descended from, Boatswain Damon told Will. Will was again impressed by the boatswain's knowledge and wondered how he always knew so much about so many different things. Captain Hawkins had completed his trading, and once the cargo of timber, ivory, and rubber he purchased was loaded, he intended to go to the next port immediately. After Will finished his duties for the day, he informed the boatswain he was going to search for the local griot. It didn't take him long to be directed to the right person in Monrovia. Kamau Mau was considered one of the most respected and intelligent griots in the country. His hut was located on the outskirts of the town on the edge of the savannah. The day was cloudy and the threat of a heavy tropical rain was in the air. According to the directions Will was given, it said the griot's home was next to a baobab tree. He asked people how would he know the tree and was told that it doesn't have leaves and looks like its roots are sticking in the air. Will easily recognized the tree from a distance, so he knew he was almost there. When he reached the door of the griot's hut, he gently knocked and waited for a response. After several minutes of knocking and waiting, Will decided to leave and return to the ship before the impending storm. As he began walking past the baobab tree, he noticed an opening at the base. He peered inside the dark opening, and on the far side of the hollowed-out trunk was a man on his knees who appeared to be praying and singing. Without turning, the person said, "Hello, William Perry, I will be with you in a moment." Startled, Will stumbled back in surprise, not only by the fact the person knew he was there without looking, but his name as well. The man in the tree came out rubbing his eyes to get them accustomed to the daylight. "I was expecting you. Follow me," the griot said as he stepped into his hut. Inside, there were drawings of all kinds hanging on the walls and stacked in the corners. There were pictures of the mountains in the northeast of Liberia, the rolling coastal plains, and the best drawing of all was of the baobab tree. These drawings were all pencil sketches, but they looked like they were alive and impressed Will as much as Paul Gauguin's had. "Did you do all of these drawings?" Will asked. "Yes, but I only draw when I feel inspired," the griot answered. "I may draw one picture every 2 or 3 years, so these pictures represent a lifetime of inspiration. I just completed this one of the baobab tree this week, and that's why I was inside the tree singing about the gifts it gives us." "What gifts does the tree give?" Will asked. "The baobab tree gives so much. It is called the tree of life because it provides food, shelter, and water," Kamau Mau said. "The bark can be used to make rope and clothes, the fruit is eaten, the leaves I use for medicine, and the tree can store hundreds of gallons of water to be used during the dry season. In fact, the old tree outside is about to get a good drink any second now once the rain starts." Just as the griot said that, lightning pierced the sky, followed by a loud clap of thunder. The sky seemed to open and the rain began to fall. "I see why they call it the tree of life," Will said as he sat there thinking of all he was learning about Africa. He also thought of the oak tree back home and how it made him feel when he sat in its branches, so he knew the power of trees. "So, William Perry, have you come to me to help find your ancestors?" the griot asked. "Yes, I have," Will answered. "But how did you know that, and how did you know my name?" "Everyone in Monrovia has heard that you're searching for your roots," Kamau Mau said. "I will tell you about some African people that your people in Canada may have something in common with, but only you will be able to solve the mystery of your ancestors. Come sit and we'll talk while we have some of my special baobab tea and the tree's fruit, which is called monkey bread." Griot Kamau Mau began telling Will about the Ashanti people, a major ethnic group in Ghana. They say the Ashanti migrated from the northwestern Niger River after the fall of the Ghana Empire in the 1200s. They are expert ironworking artisans that make axes, knives, hammers, chains, and other items from iron. Wood carving and pottery made by hand are other crafts they are famous for. "Everyone in my family are good with their hands, so perhaps the Ashanti is where we inherited this skill," Will said. "That may be true, but the Mandinka people may also have something in common with your family. The Mandinkas are a Mandi people of West Africa and descend from the ancient Mali Empire. They are also known as Mandingo and gained their independence in the 13th century. Many Mandinkas are farmers, and peanuts, rice, and goats are their main crops, and they are also tall like you, Kamau told him. My family are also farmers, so I can see there could be a connection with their culture as well, Will said. Kamau agreed with him and then began telling him about another culture of people in Liberia that Will may have descended from. The largest ethnic group in Liberia is the Capelli people, who live mostly in Bong County and other areas in central Liberia. The Capelli migrated from western Sudan in the savannah area shortly before the 16th century. The men hunt and clear the bush to create more farmland, while the women do most of the fishing and weave the fishing nets and baskets. Kamau continued, I am a descendant of the Mandinkas. The oral history is passed down through griots like me, who are also praise singers. We share our oral history through music, especially using the musical instrument called the kora. The kora is a 21-string harp-like instrument made out of a gourd covered with cow skin with the strings made from fishing line. Griot Kamau reached behind him and pulled out his kora and began to play. The melodious sound filled the little hut as Will swayed back and forth with his eyes closed in time to the music. Later that evening, when Will was preparing to leave, the wise griot had some final words of wisdom to share with Will. Remember, Mr. William Perry, it doesn't matter if you find out which people you descended from, because we are all children of a higher power. Will left Griot Kamau's house with a renewed spirit. The rain had stopped and a beautiful double rainbow crossed the sky overhead. He was uplifted by all the knowledge he had learned and the peace of mind he now had about where he came from. When he arrived back at the Flying Clipper, Boatswain Damon was waiting for him at the top of the gangplank. You must have found the griot, because there seems to be a change in you, matey, the boatswain told Will. I had one of the most beautiful experiences in my life. Thank you so much for the suggestion to go and see the griot Kamau, Will said. He told the boatswain everything that happened, how he felt, and that the griot helped him to understand more about where his family came from. His history was not only a part of the North American Indian culture, but the African culture as well. This made Will feel doubly proud to be descended from such special people. For the rest of the journey along the African coast, Will learned more about this great continent. African civilizations contributed a lot to the world since the beginning of recorded history. The monarchy of Ta Seti was founded in Nubia in what today is the Sudan. Ancient Egypt is known for its great monuments and feats of engineering required to build the pyramids. The Egyptians also produced early forms of paper and written language, along with advances in other fields as well. Other great African civilizations that made major scientific advances were the Kush, Axum, Ghana, Mali, and Zimbabwe. Many people never realized that before the transatlantic slave trade, Europeans and Africans viewed each other as equals. The discovery of gold and other natural resources is what caught the attention and interest of 13th and 14th century Europe. By the time the Flying Clipper was approaching the Cape of Good Hope, Will felt he had a solid foundation of information related to his father's ancestral homeland. He couldn't wait to share this information with his family and John Freeman Walls' family when he returned home. He went to the bridge to join Captain Hawkins and assist him as they were getting closer to the southern tip of Africa. Hello, Captain. I thought I would come and join you on the bridge to help as we sail around the Cape of Good Hope, just like I did when we went around Cape Horn in South America, Will said. Great idea. I'm sure I will need your help, Captain Hawkins said. Set the ship's course for 34 degrees, 21 minutes, 29 seconds south by 18 degrees, 28 minutes, 19 seconds east for the Cape of Good Hope. Why do they call it the Cape of Good Hope, Will asked Captain Hawkins. The first European to reach the Cape in 1488 was the explorer Bartholomew Dias from Portugal. He called it the Cabo das Tormentas, which means Cape of Storms. The King of Portugal, John II, renamed it Cabo de Bon Esperança, which means Cape of Good Hope, because it opened a sea route to India and the East. To sailors, it is simply referred to as the Cape. Some people think the Cape of Good Hope is the southernmost part of Africa and is the dividing point between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. However, Cape Agualas, which is about 90 miles east-southeast, is further south, the captain said. Will knew the experience he gained from sailing around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America would help him as he assisted Captain Hawkins in maneuvering the Flying Clipper around the Cape of Good Hope. The challenges we may face going around the Cape could make our trip around the Horn seem like a pleasure cruise. The good news is the sailor that does survive gets to put both feet on the table when they dine, rather than just one foot. We are going to stop at Cape Town to take extra supplies on board, because we will need them for the rough journey ahead of us. Originally, the Dutch colonial administrator John van Riebeek, on April 6, 1652, established Cape Town as a resupply camp for the Dutch East India Company. Picking up supplies of fresh water and food is so vital for ships while doing this trip that Cape Town has become known as the Tavern of the Seas, Captain Hawkins said as he smiled at Will. The Flying Clipper loaded the new supplies as quickly as possible. The captain wanted it to be daylight when they reached the most dangerous waters of the Cape. Boatswain Damon, along with Seamen Matthew and Joseph, were in the engine room, making sure the source of power keeping the ship moving forward would not fail. Will understood why the Cape of Good Hope was also called the Cape of Storms. The Flying Clipper had encountered good weather along the coast, but as they neared the Cape, it began to change dramatically. The warm currents from the Indian Ocean and the cool currents of the Antarctic Ocean was the cause of the increasing stormy weather and rough seas. Unlike Cape Horn, the bad weather did not come suddenly but began the moment they left Cape Town. The intensity of the storm increased the further they traveled. Before it reached its peak, Captain Hawkins took this opportunity to talk to Will and prepare him for what was ahead. From the looks of the storm, we may only have a 50-50 chance of survival. I hope all goes well, Captain Hawkins told Will. Will nodded his head. He had already anticipated this journey could be very dangerous. He would find out soon just how dangerous it was about to become. The rain increased and the wind blew harder and harder. The ship was swaying back and forth, appearing ready to tip completely over at any moment. Will was thankful for the rope tied around his waist, otherwise he would have surely been washed overboard. The sky became so dark it became pitch black outside. The wind was now at gale force strength, and Will wondered if the captain's assessment of a 50% chance of survival was too high. Just as that thought crossed his mind, the main mast was hit by lightning and snapped in half. Part of it hung over the rail in the rough waters as the wind continued to toss the ship around. Fortunately, the sails had been lowered and they depended on the engine for power. Otherwise, there would have been a messy tangle of mast and sail. The captain moved close to Will and cupped his hands as he shouted into his ear, "Go below and get Boatswain Damon, Seaman Matthew, and Joseph. That broken mast will have to be tied down so we don't lose it overboard. If you can't do that, cut the rope and let it go into the sea. Otherwise, the way it's banging against the side of the ship, it could cause some serious damage. Also have them shut down the engine. We will ride the waves until the mast is secured." Will took the rope from around his waist and stumbled out of the bridge. He carefully made his way below deck, keeping his balance as best he could, while the ship lurched from side to side. In the engine room, Boatswain Damon and Seaman Matthew and Joseph were working frantically trying to keep the engine running. Will went to the boatswain and told him about the problem on deck and that their help was needed. "The captain says to shut down the engine so we can retrieve the mast." The boatswain grabbed a rope and then he followed the others out of the engine room. At the bottom of the stairs leading to the deck, the boatswain stopped the other three men to give them some final instructions. "We will take this rope and tie it to each of us because it will be safer if we're like one. It is very loud out there, so when we get out on deck, all communications will have to be done by hand signals. It is very important we stay focused on the task at hand because our lives will depend on it." When they reached the deck, Boatswain Damon and Seaman Joseph and Matthew were surprised at the damage that had occurred. The broken mast was being tossed around like a toothpick hitting the side of the ship. If it wasn't for the rope still attached, the mast would have been lost in the sea. The boatswain signaled the others to try and grab the rope and pull the mast back on board so they could tie it down. The weather had worsened, so accomplishing this was easier said than done. Captain Hawkins watched from the bridge as his men struggled on the deck. The rocking boat made it difficult because each time they would almost get the broken mast on board, the ship would be tossed in the opposite direction, knocking them to the floor. They made another valiant attempt to pull up the mast before the boatswain was going to cut the rope, but fortunately they were successful. The four men immediately tied the broken mast to the deck so it wouldn't end up back in the ocean. Just as they began congratulating one another on their success, a huge wave came over the top of the railing and washed Seaman Joseph overboard. The strength of the wave snapped the rope that was attached to the other men, and Joseph disappeared into the blackness below. Without thinking, Will untied the rope from around his waist to prevent taking the others with him. He then instinctively grabbed a life preserver and jumped in after Joseph. This was reminiscent of Will's first day of school when he fell into the Puce River and his brother, young Jim, had jumped in and saved his life. The difference was this wasn't the Puce River. This was the Cape, and they were in the worst storm Will had ever experienced in his life. He held the life preserver tightly in front of him as he frantically kicked his feet in the general direction the seaman had fallen into the water. With the driving rain, high waves, and the darkness, it was impossible to see. Captain Hawkins watched the horrific events on the deck unfolding, so he quickly tied a rope around the helm to try and keep the ship from losing all control. He ran down the steps to the main deck and rushed to Boatswain Damon and Seaman Matthew's side. No words were necessary as they held on to the ship's railing and peered intently into the darkness, hoping they would see the two men. The boatswain had taken the rope from around his and Seaman Matthew's waist, so he would be ready to throw this lifeline the moment he saw either one of the men. Will rode the waves some as high as 20 feet, hoping he would get lucky and find his friend. He knew even if he did, there was no guarantee either of them would make it to the ship, because the storm had not eased up at all. Finally, Will felt it was hopeless and he would have to go back. There wasn't any chance Joseph could survive this, especially without a life preserver. He turned around and headed in the general direction of where he felt the ship should be. All of a sudden, he spotted about a foot in front of him a rope floating in the water. He quickly reached and pulled it towards him. He couldn't believe it, but the rope was still tied to Seaman Joseph, and even though he was unconscious, he was alive. It was very difficult, but Will was able to tie one end of the rope around the life preserver. He made sure Joseph was on his back so he wouldn't swallow any more water, and then he began swimming towards safety. In what seemed like hours since Will jumped off the ship to save his friend, although he had learned later it had been only minutes, he spotted the shape of the ship in the distance. "There they are!" Seaman Matthew shouted. The three men on the deck could barely see the two figures bobbing up and down among the high waves. Boatswain Damon prepared the rope to throw to the two men. He knew that timing was very important because there would probably be only one good chance, especially with the blowing wind. Will could see the men on deck frantically waving for him to come closer. He was exhausted and he could barely kick his legs, but he knew he had to keep going. When he was several feet from the side of the ship, he saw a rope flying through the air in his direction. He weakly reached up to catch it, but missed. An opportunity for being saved was gone. Suddenly there was a large splash just to Will's left. He quickly turned in time to see Seaman Matthew break the surface of the water, holding one end of the rope. Matthew had decided to jump in and bring the lifeline to Will and Joseph. In 5 quick swimming strokes, he was beside Will, wrapping the rope around the life preserver. He waved one hand in the air to the captain and the boatswain, and then they began to pull them aboard. By this time, there were other sailors rushing around, assisting in getting Will and Seaman Joseph to the sick bay. The last thing Will remembered before passing out was Captain Hawkins looking down at him and saying, "I guess this means you get to put both feet on your mother's table." 2 days later, when Will awoke from a fever, he felt like he had been run over by a herd of elephants. He could barely raise his head, and when he spoke, it was just above a whisper. Boatswain Damon was the first one to visit him when word spread on the ship that he had regained consciousness. "How you feeling, matey?" the boatswain asked. "I'm okay, but how is Seaman Joseph doing?" Will wanted to know. "He's doing great. He's sitting up and eating. His brother Seaman Matthew has stayed by his side since the accident," Boatswain Damon assured him. "Seaman Matthew and Joseph are brothers? I didn't know that," Will said. "Yes, they are," Boatswain Damon said. "When you jumped in the water to go save Joseph, it took all of my strength to stop Matthew from following you. All he kept shouting was he had to save his brother because it was the only family he had. I was able to convince him that he would be needed more on the ship to help get you two on board once you return. Fortunately, you were successful. Otherwise, I don't think Matthew would have ever forgiven me for holding him back." Will lay there thinking back over how events unfolded during that stormy night when the Flying Clipper sailed around the Cape. Within a week, Will and Seaman Joseph were back doing their duties on the ship. It took a few days to repair all the damage inflicted by the broken mast during the storm. After the repairs had been made, the captain had the boatswain call all the men on deck. "Gentlemen," Captain Hawkins began, "there will be a change in plans. Because of all the delays, we will be making just one stop on the west coast of India to trade for spices before returning home." The men were all happy with this news, especially since the trip around the Cape had seemed to take a lot out of them physically and mentally. Will, in fact, had made a decision this would be his last journey on the Flying Clipper. He was missing his family, and he was ready to settle down. He knew his father would be happy he finally got this traveling the world business out of his system. He never shared his intentions with anyone aboard ship, just in case he changed his mind like he did before. When they arrived back to the New York harbor, it had been over a year since they had left. The weary but excited crew all came on deck. They stood and watched with smiles on their faces as they waited patiently to see what every American sailor looks for whenever they return home: the Statue of Liberty. This large statue of a female is dressed in a robe with a 7-point spiked halo, which represents the 7 seas and 7 continents. She is holding a stone tablet in her left hand and a flaming torch in her right, which signifies enlightenment. The tablet has the date July 4th, 1776, that commemorates the United States Declaration of Independence from England. France presented this monument to the United States in 1886 as a gesture of friendship between the two countries. When the Statue of Liberty came into view, the men began cheering because many of them knew they were finally home. Once the ship had docked, the sailors immediately began unloading as quickly as possible. They were all anxious to spend time with their family and friends before their next journey. Will was excited like the rest of them, but sad at the same time because he knew this had been his last trip. Boatswain Damon was the first person Will decided he would break the news to. He found him in the engine room checking to make sure any repairs that would be necessary were done while they were docked into New York Harbor. "Boatswain, have you got a moment for me to talk to you?" Will asked. "Sure, matey. Looks like everything is okay in here. This engine is sure one tough machine. It always requires very little repair after each trip, especially since you started fixing it and doing minor changes to make it more efficient. You were right when you said Henry Ford taught you a lot about engines. So what do you want to talk about?" Boatswain Damon wondered as he led Will out of the engine room, wiping oil off his hands as he went. "It's time for me to finally return home," Will said. "I miss my family, and I'm sure they miss me. Besides, it's time to think about settling down now that I'm getting older. The adventures I've experienced and the people I've met on the Flying Clipper will be something I will remember my whole life, and because of you and the captain, I now consider myself a sailor. Thank you, my friend." The two men shook hands as they stood outside the engine room door. "I want you to come and visit me sometime, and we can talk about old times," Will told his friend. "Thanks for the invitation, but like Captain Hawkins, I get land sickness if I go too far inland and away from the sea," Boatswain Damon said, laughing. The two men returned to their cabin, where they talked for hours about the last few years they had spent together. When Will left the cabin, he said goodbye to Seaman Matthew, Joseph, and the rest of the crew that were still on the ship. He then went below deck, where he found Captain Patch Hawkins in his cabin with his door open. He was leaning over maps the same way Will saw him the first time he came on board the Flying Clipper. He stood at the open door watching the captain as he determined what their next trade route would be. Will admired the man because despite his handicaps, the leg he lost to a shark in the Bahamas and the patch over his eye caused by an old American Civil War injury, he was the toughest person he had ever met. Will gently knocked on the door to get the captain's attention. "Excuse me, sir. I wanted to come and let you know that I have decided to return home and to thank you for all the things you taught me about sailing," Will said. "I should be thanking you," Captain Hawkins said. "You helped me when we sailed around South America and Africa, and if it wasn't for you, I don't know if we would have made it safely. I was hoping you would always stay with us, but I understand if you must leave." The two men shook hands, and then the captain gave Will a big bear hug. At the bottom of the gangplank, Will stood looking at the Flying Clipper, thinking back to all the incredible adventures he had on board. Reluctantly, he turned and headed for the train station to catch the train to Detroit. His seafaring days were over.